Have you ever known a place that remembered you? Not a person, not a photograph, but a quiet patch of earth where the breeze bends just right and the light falls exactly as it used to. A place that seems to hold your footsteps even after you're gone. There's a tree by a river older than any house nearby. Its long, slender branches brush the water like fingers tracing memories. Beneath it sits a man, Eli, whose life has slowed to the rhythm of rain and old stories. He doesn't say much. He doesn't need to. The tree remembers for him. Tonight, as the rain falls gently on the roof and the wind hums through the leaves, we'll walk with Eli. Not to change the past, but to rest beside it. So settle in and let the river carry you. There is a bend in the river where time does not rush. The water there moves with a hush, as if it knows someone is listening. It weaves past smooth stones and over sleepy roots, whispering stories too quiet for the world to hear. Unless, of course, you've spent enough evenings watching the light fade and the mist rise like breath from the land itself. This part of the river isn't marked on any maps. It isn't something you stumble across on your way to someplace else. No, it's a kind of place you return to, because something in you already belongs there. And there, resting beneath the long green arms of a willow tree, lives a man named Eli. He is not young, but he is not old in the way people measure age. His face carries lines that time drew gently, creases shaped more by laughter than worry, by long days in the sun and quiet ones by the fire. He wears the same flannel shirt most days, faded red, soft at the elbows. He keeps a small folding knife in the left breast pocket, not because he needs it often, but because it belonged to someone who once mattered very much. That's how Eli lives now. Not by grand gestures, but by the slow keeping of small things. His house sits just up the hill, modest and wooden, its porch shaded in summer and creaking softly with every season. Some mornings the wind passes through the screen door with a sigh, as if the house itself is waking with him. Inside, everything has its place, not because Eli is orderly, but because over the years, the objects in the silence have agreed on where they like to be. A chipped mug on the windowsill, a tin of dry tea beside the stove, a photograph tucked behind a lamp, where it catches light at just the right angle in the late afternoon. The floors hum when he walks, old boards remembering footsteps. There's no clock ticking loudly here, just the gentle rhythms of living. The sound of water in the pipes, the soft brushing of broom bristles on the porch, the hush of the kettle just before it sings. Eli wakes early, not because he must, but because he enjoys the company of the morning before the world stirs. He lights the stove, slow and mindful, as if kindling a small sun in his kitchen. He stands by the window with his cup, watching the fog stretch its limbs across the field, watching the river rise with light, watching the willow shift its silhouette against the sky. He doesn't speak aloud most mornings, but there is a quiet conversation happening all the same, between him and the land, between the breath of the earth and the breath in his chest. The willow especially knows him. It's been there longer than the house, longer than the barn that collapsed last winter, longer than his knees have ached, longer than the woman he still whispers to when he thinks no one is listening. Its roots drink from the river's edge, anchoring it through storms and summer heat. Its branches sway like slow dancers, trailing into the water when the wind is kind, and in the crook where trunk meets limb, there's a curve shaped like a cradle, a place where one can lean back, eyes closed, and feel held. Eli has sat there every Sunday for as long as he can remember. When he was younger, they came together, he and her. They'd bring a blanket and a jar of peach tea, maybe a slice of cake if she'd baked the day before. She would read old novels with frayed covers, poems written in pencil on folded paper. He would carve, not birds or animals like his father once did, but initials, letters and hearts and quiet promises, pressed into the soft wood with hands that didn't need to say much. E+M. Sometimes they said nothing for hours. They simply listened to the hush of the river, to the gentle rub of willow leaves brushing one another, to the kind of silence that doesn't demand anything, only offers itself as rest. Now he still comes. The blanket is worn thinner. The jar sits empty beside him more often than not. But he sits, not out of habit, but out of something deeper, a kind of remembering that lives in the body, not the mind. He feels her beside him still, in the warmth of the air, in the way the light filters through the willow's veil, in the smell of damp earth and sun-dried linen. And the tree remembers too. Its bark bears the faint markings of his carving, nearly grown over now. Its roots still curl around the small stone she used to stack while humming. Sometimes the wind rustles the leaves just so, and for a moment he swears he hears her laugh, not loudly, not as a sound, but as a feeling, a brief lifting of the heart, a brightness in the breath. Eli does not chase the memory. He does not try to hold it. He simply lets it be. Like the clouds that come and go, like the river which never repeats itself exactly, but always returns. And as the morning grows, he stays there, watching the water, watching the wind, watching the world become itself again. Because here, beneath the willow, time is not something to spend. It is something to sit with. Some memories do not arrive like flashbacks. They return the way early fog does, soft, uncertain in shape, but unmistakably there. Eli never chased his memories. He simply let them return as they pleased, the way the willow let its leaves fall when the season said so. This morning, as he sat beneath that old tree, with the river murmuring nearby, one such memory came quietly to him, not in words, but in a feeling that drifted in with the breeze, a warm hush, the scent of old paper, and the sound of turning pages. It was autumn when they first met, the kind of autumn that blushes slowly, where leaves do not fall in a rush, but let go one by one, like careful decisions. He'd walked into the town library, not out of urgency, but to warm himself. The wind that morning had found its way through every seam of his coat, and he thought perhaps a book and the smell of aged pinewood shelves might be enough to make him forget how lonely the wind had felt. The library wasn't large. It stood between a post office and a bakery, both of which had bells that jingled when their doors opened, but the library had no bell, only the sound of quiet shoes on wooden floors, and the occasional soft voice of someone asking where to find the history books or the poetry section. Eli didn't come for anything specific. Sometimes he'd read about birds, sometimes about tools he'd never use, and sometimes he would just sit in the corner with a cup of tea from the thermos he carried in his bag. That day, though, he saw her first from the reflection in the window. She was sitting near the back where the light came in soft and angled through dusty panes. She had a scarf the color of river moss wrapped loosely around her neck, and she was reading something, carefully, like the words deserved time. He didn't speak. Not then. He just noticed the way her fingers paused on the edge of a page, the way her head tilted slightly when a line must have moved her, the way her presence, though still, somehow filled the room in a way he hadn't seen before. It wasn't until the following week that he dared to sit near the same row of books. She was there again. Same time, same light, different scarf. This time he brought with him an old collection of poems he hadn't opened in years. It was more of a prop than a choice, but he pretended to read, all while stealing glances when he thought she wouldn't notice. But she did, and she smiled. Not a grand, toothy thing, just a slight curve, like the start of a ripple across still water. And just like that, something unspoken settled between them. Not a spark, not a fire, just warmth, the kind that builds slowly and stays. For weeks after, they shared space like two familiar birds on separate branches, close, but not rushing toward anything. It wasn't until the third or fourth Thursday, he never could remember exactly which, that she spoke first. "You read very quietly," she said, closing her book, with both hands. He looked up, caught a bit off guard, and then nodded with a small smile. "I try not to disturb the dust," he answered, and she laughed. A soft laugh, like wind finding its way through reeds. It was a sound he would remember more clearly than her name that day, which he didn't learn until much later. After that, they began to exchange titles. One day, she left a note on the armrest of his chair. "Try page 47. Inside, he found a poem about a man who plants trees he will never sit beneath. It stayed with him long after, even now, when the trees he planted behind the barn had outlived his tools. Eventually, they began to walk. Not far, just a block or two past the bakery, down toward the creek where the blackbirds roosted. She always carried a small bag with a book, an apple, and a pencil, and he carried his hands in his coat pockets, warm and still. One afternoon, she paused at the bridge and leaned against the wooden rail. "Do you ever think trees remember people?" she asked. He had blinked slowly, then replied, "I think some people never leave trees." "That's close enough." She didn't answer, only nodded, and somehow he knew they would visit that willow together soon. Back beneath the tree now, Eli stirred gently in his seat. A single leaf drifted down and landed on his knee. The present had returned. The river still moved, the birds still called, and the sky above the branches still held the same pale blue it had back then. He looked out across the water and exhaled, not with sorrow, but with a kind of quiet gratitude, for the season that brought her, for the scarf that matched the moss, for the sound of her laugh, and for the memory that came back to him, not as a sharp ache, but as a soft, familiar blanket. He leaned his head against the curve of the willow and closed his eyes. The breeze picked up slightly and tugging at the hem of his coat, but Eli stayed still, because in that moment he wasn't alone. And the willow knew it too. There are days when the rain does not rush. It does not arrive in thunder or in sheets. It comes gently, like an old friend slipping through the porch screen, settling into the corners of the house and staying a while. On those days, Eli brewed tea without hurrying. The kettle sang its quiet song, and the steam rose like breath from a dreaming horse. He used the brown ceramic mug, the one with the chipped rim and faint trace of lavender in the glaze. It had once been part of a set. Now it stood alone. Like many things in the house, it had no need for a companion, just memory. Rain tapped gently on the windows, not to be heard, but to be known. And Eli, as he often did, took his cup into the small back room, where the writing desk sat facing the window, and the willow tree, bare now, its long fingers tracing the gray sky, stood watching, like a kind-hearted sentinel. This was the room where she used to sew. where sunlight once fell across spools of thread and cloth cut into shapes, where a cat, now long gone, used to nap in the half-open drawer. Eli had not changed much. The thimble still sat on the corner. The chair still creaked the same way when he sat in it. He reached into the drawer and pulled out the stack of envelopes, tied with a simple string, each one addressed in his careful hand. Dear M. They were not letters meant to be sent, not in the way people expect letters to travel. No stamps, no dates, just the quiet habit of speaking to someone who is no longer sitting across from you, but who still lives in the spaces between thought and breath. He untied the string. The pages were soft now, corners curled from time and touch. He chose a blank one from the back, picked up the pen with the smooth wooden grip, and began to write. The rain has returned, he wrote, and the house smells like cinnamon and pine. That was true. He'd set a stick of cinnamon bark on the stove earlier that morning, a habit she had taught him. Something about scent being memory's most patient keeper. I walked down to the river yesterday, he continued. The water was slow, like it was waiting. The willow has lost most of her leaves now. I thought of your hands brushing them from your coat, that laugh you tried to hide when one landed in your tea. He paused there, not because the thought hurt, but because it held. Outside, the rain had gathered in a steady rhythm, trickling through the gutter, dripping from the corner of the eave. He listened. In this kind of quiet, the world does not vanish. It deepens. He returned to the letter. I picked up the blanket you made, the blue one with the stitched edges that never quite lined up. You said it looked crooked. I told you that crooked things hold warmth better. He smiled, folded the letter, did not seal it. There was no need. It would join the others in the drawer, not hidden, just resting. Sometimes when the ache was too sharp, he would read them aloud. Sometimes he would fall asleep with one open beside him, the ink like a thread still warm. But mostly he wrote them not to remember her, but to remain himself, to keep the shape of love in his hands, even if only through pen and paper. The room grew dim as the afternoon wore on. He didn't light the lamp right away. He let the soft gray settle around him like a shawl, and then he sat still, the kind of stillness that isn't about doing nothing, but about letting everything else fall away. The sound of the rain, the soft creak of the desk, the slight shifting of the old wood underfoot, they were all part of the quiet. Eventually he rose, took the letter, placed it with the rest, retied the string. Then he went to the front porch, still holding the cup, though it had long gone cold. The rain had softened to mist now, the kind that hangs in the air instead of falling. He stood under the awning, watching as the fog rolled low across the field. The willow tree, though bare, looked no less alive. It simply wore the season differently. He thought, as he often did, that people were not so different. We do not vanish when we lose what we love. We shift, we bend, we carry memory like rings inside us. Somewhere in the hush, he thought he heard her hum. A tune with no words, just a rhythm of hands at work, of quiet evenings shared, of love made ordinary and real. And then, as the sky grew darker and the mist curled along the porch rails like smoke, Eli whispered, not to be heard, but to be felt, "Tomorrow I'll write again." And he would, not because he must, but because love, even after it has changed shape, still asks to be spoken to. It was just after first frost when he came, not loudly, not in the way that calls attention, but quietly, like most of life's most meaningful arrivals. Just enough to be noticed, just enough to stay. Eli had heard the sound before he saw the visitor, a low, unsure scratch along the porch step, then a pause, then a second, softer one, like hesitation given shape. The morning had been still, except for the wind nudging dry leaves across the yard. It was the kind of morning when even the birds keep to their perches, huddling feathers tight against the cold. The air was sharp with the scent of pine bark and chimney smoke, a reminder that winter was near. He opened the door slowly, not with alarm, but with the calm of a man who had learned that most things come in peace if met that way. There, tucked into the shadow between the rocker and the rail, was a small gray cat, thin, scrappy, with one ear bent slightly at the tip. The animal looked up at him with eyes the color of overcast skies, watchful but not wild, tired but not afraid. Eli didn't speak. He only stepped back inside, filled a small bowl with warm water from the kettle, crumbled half a biscuit from breakfast, and set them both down on the top porch step. When he returned a few minutes later, the food was gone, but the cat remained, curled now in a half circle against the wooden rail, tail tucked under chin, paws drawn close, asleep or pretending to be. He let the animal rest. Over the next days, the cat came and went, never quite announcing himself, never quite belonging, but always arriving just as the sky turned its softest shade of gold. Those quiet hours before dusk, when the wind seemed to listen and the world exhaled, Eli began leaving food each evening, nothing elaborate, just small offerings of what he had, bits of cooked egg, some cheese, warm broth poured into a saucer. The cat accepted these things with the dignity Eli respected. He never meowed or pawed, only ate slowly, then sat near the porch edge, gazing toward the field as if watching something Eli could not see. One night the frost came thick. The window panes were edged in white, and the porch glistened with a quiet shimmer. Eli opened the door to find the cat already waiting, but not on the step. He was curled neatly in the old straw basket that once held newspapers, then yarn, then nothing. Eli had placed an old flannel towel inside it earlier that week, not for any reason in particular, just a gesture, the kind you make without expecting anything back. The cat had taken it as invitation. From then on, he stayed. Eli never gave him a name. He figured the cat had already been given many, some kind, some not, and perhaps none of them ever fit quite right. So he simply referred to him in thought and habit as he. He had a presence that didn't ask for notice, just company. He followed Eli around the house like a thought. Not loud, not demanding, just there. In the mornings, Eli would wake to find the cat sleeping in the chair across from the stove. In the evenings, the two would sit together on the porch, each watching the sky grow dim in their own way. Eli would sip his tea, the cat would twitch an ear at the wind, and both would listen to the silence that settled like snow. There was something comforting about his presence. A rhythm returned to the house, a second set of footsteps on the floorboards, a reminder that life still chose to knock, softly, even after so many seasons alone. On colder nights, the cat would curl beside Eli's feet, purring low like the hum of a distant storm, and Eli, without much thinking, would reach down and rest a hand gently along his back. Neither needed words. It was enough to be near another warm thing in the dark. One afternoon, as winter leaned in closer, Eli found himself humming. It was a simple tune, one she used to hum while baking. It rose slowly from his chest without intention, just arrived. He realized the cat was watching him, ears slightly perked, so he kept humming. Not for the cat, not even for her, but for the house, for the walls that had heard it before, for the willow which stood bare but listening. That night he took out one of the letters again, not to write, but to read. He sat by the fire, the cat curled in his lap, and opened the envelope slowly. He read aloud, not with sorrow, but with that same soft hum in his throat. The words floated in the room, danced with the firelight, and settled into the wood like warmth. When he finished, he did not close the envelope. He let it rest open on the table, as if some part of her might want to finish reading it herself. Then he leaned back, closed his eyes, and listened to the cat's slow breath rise and fall. Outside, the willow tree moved gently, though there was no wind. Only the hush of a house no longer entirely quiet. Only the stillness of two lives, one human, one feline, learning in their own way how to sit beside grief without being broken by it. The sun had returned, but only just. It was the kind of midwinter light that draped across the ground in long, tired stretches. Never quite warm, never in a hurry, but kind enough to coax the frost back into the soil for a little while. The sky was the pale blue of worn linen, and the air still held a breath of cold in its lungs. But the birds had started to speak again. Soft little notes, like hesitant questions exchanged across branches. Eli stood at the edge of his porch, a worn wool coat draped over his shoulders, watching a line of steam rise from his mug and dissolve into the morning. Beside him, curled with tail over paws, the cat blinked slowly at the sun. It was one of those rare mornings when everything was both still and gently shifting. The kind of morning where time felt less like a line and more like a quiet room you could sit in for as long as you liked. That's when he heard the footsteps, not heavy, not rushed, just the uneven beat of small boots on the gravel path. He turned slowly, the way one does when they're not expecting anyone but are open to the possibility. A boy, maybe 8 or 9, stood at the gate. He had a red knit cap pulled low over his ears and a paper bag clutched in one hand like it held something important. Eli didn't speak first. He rarely did. The boy fidgeted for a moment, then looked up. "My mom says you might need eggs." Eli blinked, then nodded. "Could be," he said. "I have been out for a while." The boy walked forward a few paces, but stopped short of the steps. "I brought some," he said, lifting the bag slightly. The cat stood and stretched, hopping down from the porch and padding toward the boy. He didn't flinch, just watched with cautious curiosity as the cat brushed gently past his leg, then returned to the shade beneath the rocking chair. Eli took a few slow steps and accepted the bag. Inside were 4 eggs, nestled in straw. He could tell by their weight and the faint warmth that they were fresh, probably gathered that very morning. "Your chickens lay well in this cold?" he asked. The boy nodded. "We got the coop fixed up with blankets." Eli smiled. He liked that answer. "Tell your mom thank you," he said. The boy paused. "She says you used to grow the best tomatoes." Eli chuckled softly. "Only because she bought them." That earned a smile from the boy, the kind that's a little lopsided and entirely genuine. There was a small silence after that, not uncomfortable, but unsure. Eli reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small wrapped biscuit. He kept a few on hand ever since the cat had started staying. One for him, one for the guest. He held it out. "For the walk back," he said. The boy hesitated, then took it with a quiet, "Thanks." Before turning to go, he glanced back up at the porch. "Is the cat yours?" Eli looked down at the gray figure now grooming one paw with great deliberation. "I suppose he's whoever he chooses to be," he said, "but he's here most days." The boy nodded, then turned, stepping back along the path, his boots crunching gently against the softened ground. Eli watched him go, the way he watched most things, with stillness and appreciation. When the boy passed the willow tree, he paused. He reached up and touched one of the low-hanging branches, then let it sway back into place. Something about that small gesture settled into Eli like warmth. Later that afternoon, Eli brought the eggs inside and cracked one into a pan. He let it sizzle slowly, letting the sound fill the kitchen like old music. The cat remained on the windowsill, watching the bare limbs of the trees sway and settle again. They ate quietly, a shared stillness, warm and full. Afterward, Eli returned to the porch with a book he hadn't read in years. Not to read it, just to hold it, to remember the weight of it in his hands, to feel the texture of its worn edges, to open it and let an old dried leaf fall from between the pages. He didn't know when they had placed it there. Perhaps she had, one autumn afternoon. It didn't matter. It was there, now. The cat stretched and turned once before curling again beside his feet. Eli looked out across the yard, toward the gate, toward the willow tree, and toward something else he could not quite name. That evening, he wrote another letter, not out of grief, not out of longing, but out of habit. "Today," he wrote, "a boy brought me eggs." He wore a red hat and didn't seem bothered by the cold. He touched the willow branch before leaving. "It reminded me of the first time I showed it to you. Do you remember? You said it looked like a doorway." He paused there, not because he didn't know what to say, but because the moment had said enough. He folded the letter, tied it with the others, and set it gently in the drawer. The house was quiet, but not empty. The cat sighed in his sleep, a single twitch of the ear the only movement in the room. Outside, the last light of the day faded behind the trees, and the moon, barely more than a silver thread, rose slowly over the river's bend. There are days in late winter when the wind forgets to blow. The sky, though pale and thin, stretches itself wide, as if trying to remember what warmth felt like. And the earth, still stiff in places, begins to soften at the edges, not ready to bloom, but ready to breathe. That was the kind of day Eli woke into. It began like most mornings, a gentle hush in the house, the low creak of the floorboards under his feet, the stove taking its time to warm the kitchen air. But when he stepped outside with his tea, something in the stillness caught him. The cold had loosened its grip, not gone, but softened. He stood for a long moment at the top of the porch steps, watching the faint steam of his breath rise and drift, not away, but sideways, like a thought changing its mind. The cat followed him out, padding silently across the worn boards, stretching beside the sunniest patch of rail. Eli looked toward the back field, and beyond that, the garden. It had not been tended in some time, not because he had given up on it, but because some things grow better when left alone. Still, today, the ground looked less like memory and more like invitation. He went inside, pulled on his older boots, the ones with soil still clinging to the seams, and his heavy coat with the elbow patches beginning to fray. The cat did not follow him down the path, but watched from the porch, eyes blinking slow in the brightening light. The garden gate creaked, not from disrepair, but from the kind of age that speaks softly. Eli stepped in, his boots pressing gently into the softening ground. Weeds had moved in where a rose used to rut. The wooden stakes were leaning now, twine long gone, swallowed by weather and time. But he didn't mind. He walked slowly along the edge, as if reacquainting himself with the familiar room. He reached down and ran his hand along the topsoil, dry on the surface, damp just below. It smelled of root and leaf, of old seasons folded into one another. Here, he had grown tomatoes so sweet they tasted like the sun had been captured in their skin. Here, she had knelt beside him, planting basil and marigold, laughing at how he always misread the seed packets but somehow got it right anyway. He didn't intend to plant anything that day, not yet, but his hands found a rake anyway and began pulling back the debris of last fall. Brittle stems, pale leaves, and the occasional feather left behind by a visiting bird. He worked slowly, without purpose but not without meaning. Every pull of the rake was a quiet conversation, with the earth, with her, with himself. By mid-morning, a small patch of soil had reappeared, not neat, not perfect, but open. He sat down on the overturned bucket by the edge, rested his elbows on his knees, and looked at it. The light had shifted just enough to make the earth glow in places. He ran a hand across his brow, then rubbed the back of his neck, feeling the warmth there. Not from sun, but from movement, from doing something again that once had been part of everything. When he stood, he didn't feel tired, just returned. As he latched the gate behind him, he noticed a small green shoot near the base of the fence. Maybe mint, or something else entirely. He didn't touch it, just nodded and walked back toward the house. The cat was now asleep, head tucked in, tail curled tight. Eli stepped inside, placed the kettle on the stove, and sat at the kitchen table. He didn't write a letter that day. He didn't need to. Some memories lived best in the hands, in the way the soil crumbles, in the way the rake finds its rhythm. Later, as the sun dipped behind the hills and the shadows lengthened across the floor, he stepped back out to the porch one last time. The sky was turning the color of worn denim, and the willow's bare branches etched themselves against it like a drawing in charcoal. He looked toward the garden. The light caught that small green shoot just so, bright for a moment, then shadowed again. He smiled. Tomorrow, he thought, he might bring out the seed box, not to plan, just to look, to touch the little envelopes and remember the names: sweet pea, larkspur, chard, cosmos, things that had grown before and might grow again, not the same, but enough. He sat down beside the cat, rested his hand on its back, and closed his eyes. The wind had not returned. The air was still, and in that stillness, Eli breathed deep, not looking forward, not looking back, just here, with the dirt beneath his nails and the memory of something green. There's a kind of light that only happens late in the afternoon. Not golden, not quite gray, but something in between, like the world is remembering how to rest. It was under that kind of light that Eli found himself standing at the base of the narrow staircase that led to the attic. The air in the house was still. The cat had fallen asleep on the rug, curled into the shape of a comma, as if pausing the day itself. The kettle had just finished boiling. A mug of black tea sat warm in Eli's hands. And yet, something, perhaps the quiet, perhaps the soft hum of the floorboards, nudged him toward the stairs. He hadn't been up there in a while, not out of avoidance, just waiting for the right day. And today, with the garden breathing again, with the scent of turned soil still under his nails, It felt like a good time to go looking not for answers, but for what was left behind. The steps creaked as he climbed, each one giving a small voice, like a memory remembering itself. At the top, he reached for the old metal latch, twisted it open, and stepped into the attic. It smelled the way all good attics do, of dust, of cedar, of forgotten fabric warmed by sunlight through clouded glass. The window faced west, and the light that came in was soft and slanted, catching the edges of boxes and shelves like a finger tracing outlines in a book long unread. Eli stood for a while, just letting his eyes adjust. There was no rush here, no expectation, only the slow unfolding of time. The first box he opened held old clothes, a flannel shirt too small now, a faded apron with a button missing, a sweater she used to wear on cool mornings when the garden was still damp. He lifted it gently, folded it again, then placed it back. Some things are not meant to be rediscovered, only touched, then tucked away again. There were letters too, tied in her handwriting. He didn't open them, not today. He moved on. There was a stack of recipe cards, all handwritten, smudged at the corners with cinnamon and oil. He smiled at the one labeled Sunday bread. She had written, "Add flour slowly" in all capital letters, followed by a note in parentheses, "Trust your hands." Eli let out a soft laugh. He remembered how she never measured with cups, only with the eye and feel of things. Toward the far end of the attic was an old rocking chair, its cane seat still strong, though dusty. Eli brushed it off with his sleeve and sat down, the wood giving a long sigh under his weight. From this spot you could see the edge of the river through the hazy pane. The willow's bare arms moved gently. The wind, it seemed, had come back in whispers. He sat there for a while, mug in hand, watching the light shift, remembering nothing in particular, but feeling everything all at once. There was a tin box on the shelf beside him. Inside, photographs. They weren't in order. They never had been. But that was the beauty of them. Moments out of time, captured without the need for sequence. There was one of her in the garden, holding up a carrot still wearing dirt, grinning like she'd just found gold. One of Eli, much younger, asleep under the willow with a book on his chest. A few of neighbors long moved away, dogs long buried, barns now fallen, each one a small doorway. He didn't step through, just stood in the threshold and looked. By the time he made his way back downstairs, the light had deepened. The cat stirred as Eli passed, but didn't rise. Eli placed the mug in the sink, emptied now, but still carrying warmth. He sat by the window, watched the last of the sun slip behind the ridge, and in his pocket, he still carried the recipe card. Trust your hands. He turned it over once, then slid it between the pages of a book resting on the side table. Not for safekeeping, but for return. Some pages, like some days, are meant to be found again. That night he lit a small lamp. Not for reading, just for glow. The kind of light that doesn't push the dark away, but makes peace with it. And as he sat in the chair by the fire, the cat curled beside him again. He whispered into the hush, "It's all still here." Not in the way it once was, but here, in the fabric, in the wood, in the breath of the attic air, in the pause before a photograph is returned to its box, in the way the floorboard sighs beneath you, as if remembering every step you've ever taken. He didn't need to write a letter tonight. Everything that mattered had already been said, in thread and recipe, in stillness. He leaned back, eyes closed, and let the quiet hold him. Outside, the willow tree swayed. Inside, nothing moved, but everything was alive. It began just after nightfall, a soft, uncertain tapping, not insistent, not hurried, just enough to be known. Eli had been sitting in his usual chair by the window, the lamp beside him casting its warm circle across the floor. The cat was curled nearby. The fire had gone to embers, and the world outside had faded into the hush of evening. The rain came like breath on skin, cool, familiar, and alive. It tapped first on the tin edge of the porch roof, then on the metal basin he left beneath the eaves to catch runoff. Each droplet a note, soft percussion in the song of the dark. He didn't move, didn't even blink for a while, just listened. Rain on a tin roof is not like other rain. It speaks more directly. No filters, no leaves to muffle it, no branches to catch it, just the clean sound of falling. And it's a kind of sound that has memory tucked inside. For Eli, it brought him back, not to one moment, but to many nights layered upon each other like quilts. Nights when he and she sat close together in this very room, the oil lamp flickering between them, hands not always touching, but close enough to feel the warmth pass between them. They didn't always talk on nights like those. There wasn't much to say. The rain did the speaking. It told stories of fields resting, of seeds swelling underground, of wildflowers asleep with their roots curled inward. She would sometimes hum, very softly, a tune with no name. He'd ask her where it came from, and she'd shrug. Maybe it's the sound of the rain remembering how to sing, she once said. He'd nodded, because that sounded true enough. Tonight he heard the rhythm again. Same roof, same corner where the water fell heaviest, same steady cadence that made the house feel like a living thing, breathing with the weather, settling deeper into the land. He stood and turned off the lamp, letting the dark come in. Then he lay down on the old couch, pulling the woven throw over his chest, the one she'd made with colors that didn't quite match, but always seemed to belong together. The rain became steadier. It was the kind of rain that softened thought, that smoothed the rough edges of the day, that made time feel less like a line and more like a circle. He listened with his whole body, the way the roof sang, the way the floorboards sighed, the way the cat, now at his feet, purred just barely beneath hearing. Memory came in pieces, not images, but sensations. The dampness of wool coats hung by the door, the way her hair smelled after walking back from the garden in the drizzle, the sound of her slipping the spoon into a teacup twice, then setting it down gently on the saucer. He remembered the way her fingers traced circles on his knee when she read aloud from books they both knew by heart, the way her eyes looked, tired sometimes but lit from within. When the fire cast long shadows across her cheek, he remembered a night much like this, when the power had gone out. They'd lit candles in mason jars, carried them from room to room like small lighthouses. He had said something silly. She had laughed. Then they danced in the kitchen, slow, clumsy, barefoot on cold tile. He didn't recall the words of the song, only the feel of her head resting on his chest, only the quiet way they stopped moving but didn't let go. Now, the rain had shifted slightly. The roof caught it in a different rhythm, a gentle stutter, like fingers drumming absent-mindedly on a tabletop. Eli's eyes grew heavier. He let them close, not as an act of sleep, but as a way of listening deeper. He let the rain tell him things he didn't know he needed to hear, that the world keeps breathing even in silence, that love does not end, it simply changes its shape. It becomes the hush of a house at night, the weight of a blanket pulled over tired limbs, the soft sound of water finding its way home. Somewhere in the night, he dreamt, not vividly, not loudly, just a soft drift of images, hands folding linen, steam rising from a teacup, a trail of footsteps in damp grass, leading nowhere in particular. When he woke, the fire had gone out completely, but the rain was still falling, the same steady voice, still speaking in the dark, still offering its small comforts. He stayed still for a while longer, wrapped in warmth, wrapped in memory, and in that place between waking and sleep, Eli whispered into the quiet, "It's good to hear you again." He didn't mean the rain, not only. Morning came gently, not with a blaze of light or the call of birds, but with mist settling low over the field like an extra blanket pulled up in sleep. Eli stirred before the sun was visible, not because of any alarm, but because the house had its own way of waking. The way the kettle clicked as it cooled, the distant creak of the barn wood adjusting in the damp, the quiet shuffle of the cat changing positions at the foot of his bed. He sat up slowly, let his feet find the floor, and felt the air. It was cool, damp in a way that clung to the skin but not cold. It was a day made for wool socks and slow steps. The rain had stopped, but its voice still lingered. In the drip of water from the porch rail, in the glisten of the leaves just outside the window, in the smell of earth steeped in its own remembering, he made tea, strong and quiet, and poured it into his favorite mug, the blue one with the chipped lip, the one she used to claim kept heat better because it was a little broken. The cat sat on the windowsill, tail flicking lazily. Neither of them spoke, but both knew it was a morning for being outside. Eli took an old wool sweater from the peg by the door, slipped a small paperback into its inner pocket, and stepped into the mist. The grass was wet but welcoming underfoot. Each blade bowed slightly, as if still listening to the night's rain. The willow stood where it always had, just beyond the bend in the river. Its branches, heavy with moisture, swayed only a little, as though reluctant to disturb the peace that hung in the air. He made his way down the familiar path, one step at a time, the air cool against his face, his hands wrapped around the warmth of the mug. No birds called, no wind moved, just the quiet dripping of the trees and the soft sound of feet on wet earth. The bench beneath the willow was still there, sturdy in its age, with lichen spreading along the grain like a slow green memory. He wiped it gently with his sleeve, though the damp remained. Then he sat with the river at his feet and the fog softening the world around him into shapes more felt than seen. He sipped his tea. The steam rose briefly, then disappeared into the white hush. Eli didn't open the book right away. He rested it on his knee, felt its weight, rubbed a thumb across its spine. It was one of her favorites, not a classic, just a small collection of essays about plants and the people who grow them. She had read it aloud once, here, under this tree, pausing to add her own thoughts between paragraphs, sometimes disagreeing with the author, sometimes laughing at the old-fashioned language. He could still hear her voice in certain sentences, still remember the way she looked up mid-reading to see if he was listening. He always was, even when his eyes were closed, even when his hands were busy tying beans to their stakes. He had listened to her the way you listen to wind in tall grass, not to capture it, but to feel its passing. Now, with mist curling around the base of the willow, he opened the book. The pages were soft from use, edges feathered from fingers turning them over and over. He read slowly, not aloud, but not silently either, somewhere in between. His eyes traced the words, but his heart heard them, felt them land softly against the morning like seeds. The essay was about tending a garden in autumn, about knowing when to stop pulling weeds and simply let the earth rest. The author wrote, "There is dignity in letting the land go quiet for a while." Eli stopped there, let the sentence sit with him like company. He closed the book again, but didn't set it down. The river moved slowly before him, not rushing, but not still. He watched the way the current folded around stones, the way fallen leaves drifted then caught in small eddies, turning slowly, like they hadn't yet decided where to go next. Somewhere in the field behind him, a crow called once, then silence again. Eli took another sip from the mug, now nearly empty, the last of the heat warming the tip of his tongue. The mist had begun to lift only slightly, shapes returned to their sharper outlines, the fence line, the garden rows, the chimney of his house in the distance. But the quiet remained. It held its place like an old friend, willing to go but not in a hurry. He stayed a while longer under the willow, long enough for the shadows to shift, for the moisture on the branches to drip onto the back of his hand. He didn't move. The cold wasn't uncomfortable. It was just present, like memory, like love. When he finally stood, he took the long way back, passing by the edge of the field where the mint had started coming up again. He brushed a few leaves gently, brought his fingers to his nose, and closed his eyes. The scent was sharp and soft and full of seasons. Back at the house, he placed the book on the kitchen table, opened to the page with the underlined sentence. He didn't need to mark it. He'd remember where it was. Then he made another cup of tea, fed the cat, and stood by the window watching the last of the fog slide away from the willow. And in the hush of that fading mist, Eli felt no longing, only presence, only the truth that some mornings are meant not to do, but simply to be. And this, he thought, was one of them. The sun had not long risen when Eli noticed something resting on the porch. It was a small brown parcel. No ribbon, no note, just folded paper tied gently with twine, its corners softened by dew. He hadn't heard anyone come. The gate hadn't squeaked, the cat hadn't stirred, but there it was, quiet and certain, as if it had always meant to be there. He leaned over slowly, his knees creaking more than the step beneath him, and lifted it in both hands. The package was light. He turned it once, held it up against the morning light, filtering through the porch rail, then carried it inside. The house still smelled faintly of last night's tea. The fire hadn't been lit yet, and the air held a pleasant coolness, the kind that asked you to move gently, to speak softly. Eli placed the parcel on the table. The cat leapt up beside it, sniffed twice, then sat down with the air of one satisfied by simple things. He untied the string slowly, not because he was uncertain, but because some things deserved to be opened without haste. Inside, he found a small round tin, the kind that once held buttons or sweets. It had been cleaned, its lid polished until the faded design, a patch of strawberries, gleamed through. He opened it. Inside were cookies, homemade, uneven in shape, with the smell of cinnamon and nutmeg rising up like a memory. Beneath the tin was a folded scrap of paper, lined notebook paper torn at the edge, and written in the careful hand of a child. "My mom says these are too spicy, but I think they're good. I made them yesterday. If you don't like them, maybe the cat will. Owen." Eli smiled, the kind of smile that starts behind the ribs and takes its time to reach the mouth. He ran a finger along the edge of the note, then refolded it neatly and placed it back inside the lid. He took one of the cookies, broke it in half, and tasted it. It was soft, a little too much clove, but warm all the way through, like something baked with full attention. The cat sniffed the other half and, in a rare act of agreement, ate it delicately off the plate. Eli looked out the window. Across the field near the fence where the oak trees began, he saw a small figure in red, Owen no doubt, kicking at stones as he walked the edge of the pasture. He didn't wave, didn't call out, just watched, like one watches a leaf drift down from a tree. A small, slow movement that means more than it seems. Later that morning, Eli took down the tin again, placed it carefully on the shelf near the window, beside the old radio and the small wooden bird his wife had carved long ago. Not as decoration, not as token, but as something honest, something made, offered, received. He poured himself a cup of tea, added just a touch of honey, and sat by the window, book in lap, eyes drifting from page to field. The day unfolded slowly. By midday, the clouds had begun to thin, allowing patches of sun to move like slow dancers across the ground. Eli stepped out onto the porch with a second cup, not for need, but for pleasure, and sat in the rocker. The tin remained where he could see it, a small circle of light where it caught the sun. The cat, now stretched across the railing, twitched an ear at the sound of a bird somewhere overhead, and for a long while, nothing happened, but it was the kind of nothing that filled a man whole. He thought about writing a note back. He had stationery still, plain cream paper and matching envelopes kept in a drawer beside the dried lavender and spare buttons. But something told him Owen didn't need a reply in words. Instead, Eli stood, went to the small cupboard above the stove, and pulled out a tin of his own, not a match to Owen's, but similar in shape. Inside were 4 tea bags, ones he'd kept for guests who hadn't come in some time. He added a small jar of wild honey and a folded recipe card that read, "Hot tea for cold afternoons, best shared." He placed the items in a paper bag, tied it simply with twine, and left it on the fence post where he'd seen the boy pass. No note, only offering. That evening, just before the light gave up for the day, Eli returned to the porch. The tin was still on the table. The cat had moved again, this time curled in the chair beside his, and across the field he saw a familiar red cap bouncing toward home. No wave, no shout, just presence, enough. Eli rocked gently, cup in hand, and let the dust come as it always did, soft at first, then all at once, and as the stars began their quiet shimmer, he whispered something into the air, not toward anyone in particular, but toward the wide silence of the evening. Thank you. It wasn't for the cookies, not really. It was for the way the world still gave small gifts on ordinary days. There are certain afternoons that do not ask for anything. They arrive with the warmth of sun pressing gently against the windows, with the creak of a chair settling its joints, with the hush that settles between one task and the next. Yet this afternoon was like that. Eli had swept the porch, fed the cat, and let the kettle whistle once before lifting it from the stove. Now he stood in the hallway, halfway between the kitchen and the small back room that had once served many purposes: sewing space, reading nook, storage for dried herbs in mason jars. But more than anything, it had been the writing room, not an office, not quite a study, just a place where paper lived in drawers, and pencils were never too far from reach. He hadn't sat at the desk in a while. not because he couldn't, not because he wouldn't, only because the seasons had been speaking in other ways, through the garden, through the willow, through the rhythm of tea and fire and silence. But today, the air in the room felt different, not charged, just present, like a friend who stands at the doorway, not saying a word, but waiting to be noticed. Eli stepped in quietly. The floor gave a soft creak beneath his left heel, the same spot that always did. Dust lay along the edge of the window pane, and a curl of last year's lavender had dried into a graceful bend above the sill. The desk was still there, angled slightly toward the west, where the afternoon light came in golden and slow. He pulled the chair out gently, ran a hand across the surface of the wood. There were scratches, memories of mugs and elbows, of pages turned and letters folded. There was still a small dish in the corner, with bits of eraser and a rusted paperclip, a jar with 2 pens, one dry, one maybe not, and a square of folded paper with her handwriting on it. If you forget what to say, start with something true. He didn't unfold it. He didn't need to. He remembered the rest. He sat down slowly, letting his back meet the curve of the old chair. His arms rest naturally where they always had. He opened the top drawer, the same smooth slide, the same faint scent of cedar and ink. Inside were envelopes, a few stamps with corners curled, a bundle of blank paper tied with a bit of twine. He untied it, pulled out a single sheet and laid it flat. The light from the window moved across the page, pausing at the center, as if offering him a place to begin. He didn't write right away. His hand rested on the table, the pen unmoved. Outside, a bird called once, clear, then quiet. The cat stretched from the doorway, then padded in, leaping onto the window ledge with an ease that defied his age. And for a moment, everything was still, not paused, not waiting, just present. Then Eli picked up the pen. He didn't know who the letter would be for. It didn't matter. Sometimes the words themselves knew better. Today the light came back. He wrote, not in any grand way, just a small slant through the window, just enough to see the dust. And I realized how much I've missed this desk, missed the feel of paper beneath my hand, missed the silence that lives only in this room. He paused. The cat purred softly, one paw pressed against the glass. Nothing remarkable happened. I didn't find a new path. I didn't plan anything important. But I sat here, and it felt like remembering how to pray. He signed the letter with no name, folded it once, slipped it into an envelope and placed it on the corner of the desk. Not to mail, not even to reread, just to acknowledge that something had been said, something real. For the rest of the afternoon, he sat there with the window open a crack, letting the breeze stir the edges of paper, letting the quiet keep him company. He didn't write another letter. He didn't need to. The desk had remembered him, and he had remembered what it meant to sit still with a pen in his hand and the soft creak of the floor behind him. That evening, as dusk pressed in against the glass, he lit the lamp beside the window. The cat curled up on the rug. The fire sighed back to life, and the envelope remained on the desk. A small white shape in the glow, not asking to be read, only to be. Eli watched the light shift, listened to the hush settle in the corners, and felt for the first time in a while that the room was whole again. Not because it had changed, but because he had come back to it. There are mornings when change does not arrive with fanfare. No burst of blossoms, no sudden warmth in the air, only a slight softening, a hush in the wind, a scent so faint it takes a still mind to notice. That was the kind of morning this was. Eli stepped onto the porch with his usual cup, steam curling gently upward into a sky still blue with sleep. The sun, though not high, had a different tone to it, not quite warmer, but rounder somehow, as if it had remembered something. He took a sip, and as he looked out across the yard, his eyes paused on the edge of the garden fence. There, along the top rail, a line of shadowed frost had not reformed, and in its place, the smallest hint of green, a single bud, not opened, but present. Enough. He went back inside, set the cup on the counter, and reached for his coat. Not the heavy winter one, but the lighter jacket he used for spring chores. Its sleeves were frayed at the cuffs, and the left pocket sagged from years of holding nails. He picked up his toolbox from the back shelf, ran a hand along the worn handle, and stepped back out into the morning. The cat didn't follow. He had found a warm spot by the window and had no interest in the cool air. But Eli didn't mind. This was a morning for quiet hands, for wooden rails and rusty hinges, a morning for fixing what had waited long enough. The fence that bordered his garden wasn't broken, not truly. It stood in its place, the way old things do. A little leaned, a little tired, but still offering itself to the work. He walked its line slowly, trailing fingers along the grain of the wood, noting the places where it had given way, where moss had crept in, where nails had rusted into powder. He stopped near the far post where a board had come loose, swinging just slightly in the wind. He crouched down, let his knees settle into the damp earth, and pulled a few new nails from his pocket. Not new, really, just unused. He placed them gently between his lips, the way he always had, and reached for the hammer. Its handle was smooth from use, the head pitted and dark. He tapped once, twice, letting the rhythm return to his wrist, then again, and again. A small sound, but one that settled in the bones like the memory of old music. Eli worked slowly, not because he was tired, though the years did ask more of him, but because there was no reason to rush. Each board he touched had its own story. Some had been nailed in when he first built the fence decades ago, with her holding one end steady, laughing when he missed and hit his thumb. Some were replacements added after a windstorm or after deer had pushed their way through in search of early lettuce. He remembered each change not as a task completed but as a moment lived, a small dialogue between man and land, between what bends and what holds. By midday, the sun had warmed the backs of his hands. He stood, stretched slowly, and walked the line once more. Quadwist didn't fix everything. He didn't need to. Some leaning posts could stay that way, as reminders that nothing lasts perfect, and not everything broken asks to be repaired. He stepped into the garden, now cleared of its winter sleep. The soil was still cool, but no longer frozen. He crouched, brushed aside a patch of dead leaves, and there beneath them, green, young shoots, the first volunteers. He didn't know what they were. Could have been mint, could have been something else she planted long ago that had decided to return. Either way, they were here. He sat for a while on the upturned crate he kept by the fence, let the sun warm the back of his neck, let the air move around him without thought. Somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker knocked steadily against a tree, and a crow answered with a single low call. The breeze carried the scent of turned soil and soft pine, and Eli closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to listen, to the small voice of the morning, to the breath of the earth beneath his boots, to the feeling of wood beneath his palm, and the memory of her voice saying, We build things so we can tend them. When he opened his eyes, the garden was quiet again. He stood, wiped his hands on his coat, and walked back to the porch. The cat had moved, now perched near the window's edge, watching a bee circle the lavender by the steps. Eli stepped inside, set the hammer gently on the table, and poured himself another cup. The afternoon light had deepened, and the house held that soft golden hue that made everything, walls, paper, even dust, feel holy in its own quiet way. He sat at the kitchen table, cupping the mug with both hands, and looked out toward the fence. It stood now, just as it had before, but touched, tended, acknowledged, and in that he found something he hadn't known he'd needed. Not completion, but participation. A moment of work, a return to rhythm, a way of telling the land, I'm still here. And the land, in its silent way, had answered back. Some mornings are neither light nor dark. They arrive in gray, not the gray of sadness, but the kind that softens everything, that makes edges disappear, that blurs the lines between yesterday and now. It was a morning like that when Eli stepped into the back room. The sky outside was the color of old cotton, and the windows, though clean, carried a fine mist across the glass, as if the world was quietly exhaling. He had no plans, no list, no task, but his feet led him there, to the small room where the desk still stood, where a paper still waited. The cat followed part way, then curled up near the doorway, content to be close, but not inside. Eli sat down slowly. The chair creaked its familiar greeting, and the air smelled of old paper, wood polish, and the faint trace of lavender from the windowsill. In the bottom drawer of the desk, tucked behind a stack of blank envelopes and a tin of dried-out stamps, was a box. He knew its weight. He knew the way the lid stuck just a little at the corner. He knew the color of the string that tied it shut. A pale brown, frayed from time, but still holding. He pulled it out and placed it on the desk. The window light fell across it gently, as if recognizing an old friend. He untied the string, set it aside, and opened the lid. Inside were letters, his handwriting, neat but not careful. Some folded once, some twice, all addressed the same way, Dear M. They were not love letters, at least not in the way most people meant. They were moments, a collection of small days, of thoughts that never found a voice, things he would have said over morning coffee, or in the quiet between stories on the porch. He picked one up at random, held it in his hand for a long while before unfolding it. Today the river ran slower than usual. I watched a leaf drift past the bend. It made me think of the day we lost your scarf to the wind, how it caught in the willow and how we laughed instead of trying to retrieve it. He read it once, then folded it again, a little more gently this time, and placed it back. He picked another. I tried your biscuit recipe today. I got the salt wrong again, but the house smelled like you just left the kitchen, and that was enough. Some of the letters were only a few lines long, others stretched across pages, but none were finished, not really. They all ended the same way, not with a farewell, but with a pause, as if he might come back to them later, as if she might answer. He didn't cry, hadn't for a long time. Grief had settled itself not in tears, but in the patterns of his days, in the way he folded laundry, in the way he paused before turning on the radio, in the way he still reached for 2 mugs some mornings before catching himself. The letters were part of that pattern, not an act of mourning, not a ritual, just something he did on days when the weather leaned inward, and the house felt like a quiet hand on his shoulder. He chose 3 letters that morning, He didn't read them aloud, didn't read them all the way through. He just unfolded them, let the air touch them again, and rested them side by side on the desk. Then he made tea, left the room while the water boiled, and returned with the cup in hand. He sat once more, the window at his left, the cat now purring softly at his feet. He didn't write anything new. He didn't need to. Today wasn't about adding, it was about being near. Later, as the gray light began to lift, just slightly, he folded the letters once again, tied the box closed, and placed it back in the drawer. Not hidden, just at rest. The kind of rest that doesn't ask for forgetting, but allows the heart to breathe more evenly. He stood, stretched his back, and walked through the house slowly. The fire had kept the room warm. The cat followed again, tail brushing lightly against his ankle. Outside, the willow was still, and Eli, with no rush at all, picked up his coat and stepped onto the porch. He didn't go far, just to the edge of the yard, where the fence met the tree line, where he could see the bend in the river, in the place where her scarf once got caught. The branch had long since let it go, or perhaps it was still there, somewhere in the tall grass below. He smiled at the thought, then turned back, hands in his pockets, breath soft in the cool air. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. Everything he had meant to say was still inside the house, and in the way he walked back toward it, not as someone seeking to remember, but as someone already held by all that had ever mattered. There are some afternoons that come not to be filled, but to be felt. They arrive without urgency, with light that moves slowly across the floor, and with air so still it makes the softest motions feel like conversation. It was on such an afternoon that Eli found himself standing before the hutch, the one in the corner of the kitchen, with glass doors fogged ever so slightly by time, hinges that gave a mild groan when opened, and the faint scent of lemon oil still tucked into its wooden bones. He hadn't looked in there for some time. He had no reason to, and no need, but today something quiet called him toward it, like a hum too low to hear, but too steady to ignore. He opened the door with care, as if the things inside had just fallen asleep. The top shelf held what he expected, plates with pale blue flowers along the edges, a sugar bowl missing its lid, 2 short candle holders with wax still clinging in place. And then, near the back, tucked into the curve of a folded linen napkin, the teapot, white porcelain, simple and soft, its spout slightly chipped but not sharp, the handle stained just faintly from years of being lifted by the same hand over and over. Beside it, 3 cups, one turned upside down, and a small saucer with a hairline crack that never seemed to spread. He reached for them slowly, cradling each piece as if it might speak. He brought them to the table one by one, setting them down on the old cotton cloth he kept for drying apples in the fall. And then he filled the basin at the sink with warm water, not hot, not boiling, just warm enough to steam gently, to soften the edges of dust, to coax memory into motion. He worked slowly, not from age but from reverence. Each piece was dipped, turned, and wiped with the corner of the towel. Not scrubbed, just touched, acknowledged, the way one might greet an old friend on a quiet path. No need for words, just presence. He remembered how she used to do it. In the late afternoon, when the light was angled just right through the kitchen window, when supper was still an hour away, and the house had grown quiet with the work of the day nearly done, she would fill the basin just so, fold the towel twice, and hum something low while she worked. Not a tune he ever recognized, but one he had memorized all the same. The teapot, in particular, held something, not in its shape or design, but in the way it fit into his hand. The weight of it, the familiar balance between spout and base. He had poured from it so many times, for her, for guests, for cold mornings after chores and late evenings when thunder paced just outside the windows. He dried it carefully, pressing the towel along the handle, then inside the lid. He didn't polish away the crack in the saucer, didn't even try. Some things are meant to show their age, to wear it the way bark holds onto weather, or how a well-walked path reveals the shape of feet that came before. When he finished, he left the pieces on the towel, sunlight beginning to stretch across them. They caught the light gently, no shine, just a muted glow, like candlelight resting inside porcelain. He sat beside them at the table, his hands resting palm down, fingers still warm from the water. The cat lay at the threshold of the kitchen, eyes half closed, tail flicking just once with each breath. Nothing moved, and yet everything felt full. He didn't make tea, not this time. The water in the kettle had cooled. The afternoon had begun its slow descent toward evening, but something had already been steeped. In his hands, in the quiet, in the ritual itself. He reached out, touched the rim of one cup, and felt, more than remembered, the weight of a conversation years old. Something about a neighbor's new dog, a letter from her cousin, whether or not the violets would bloom again by the porch. Small things, the kind that hold lives together like stitches in an old quilt. Not seen from a distance, but essential up close. Before sunset, he placed the teapot and cups back in the hutch. Not behind the napkin this time, not hidden. He arranged them plainly, with the chipped saucer in front. He closed the glass doors and left a fingerprint on the pane. He didn't wipe it off, let the glass remember he had been there. That night, before he turned off the lamp by the window, he looked once more toward the hutch. The moon had risen faintly, casting just enough silver to catch the shape of the cups behind the glass. And in that moment, he felt what he often did. Not sadness, but nearness. The kind that lives in the echo of porcelain touching porcelain. In the warmth that lingers on the edge of a cloth, in the way time folds in on itself when we allow it to be still. He turned off the lamp and the house exhaled with him. The cat sighed, the wind didn't speak, and Eli, in that deep and sacred quiet, slept. There are certain afternoons when even the clouds seem to walk slowly. They stretch long across the sky, not heavy with rain, but content to linger, softening the light, cooling the breeze, and reminding the world to speak in quieter tones. Eli sat on the porch, his second cup of tea cooling beside him, his hands folded in his lap. He wasn't thinking about anything in particular, just letting the day unfold the way it chose. The cat lay nearby, its ears twitching now and then, though no birds called, and no squirrel dared cross the open yard. The air was still, not silent, but patient. That's when he noticed it, just beyond the garden gate, leaning gently against the fence, a small bicycle, red mostly, though the paint had chipped in places, and the handlebars had been wrapped in cloth to keep from biting the hands on cold mornings. One of the pedals was missing its rubber edge. The chain hung loose. It looked like it had been ridden hard and loved well, then left there, not forgotten, but paused. He hadn't heard anyone come. No knock, no voice, just a soft hush of tires over dirt, and then stillness. He rose slowly, his knees stiff from the sitting, and walked the short path through the garden. Up close, the bike looked smaller still. The seat scuffed, the basket on the front slightly dented. The kind of dents that come not from falls, but from carrying too many acorns or stones that look like they might be lucky. He reached out, let his fingers rest on the handlebar. It was warm from the afternoon light, and in that moment, without meaning to, Eli saw another bicycle, long since gone, propped in this very place, decades ago. It had been blue, a deeper blue than the sky gets in September. It had a bell, which rarely worked, and a seat she always said was too high, but never adjusted. She would ride it to the store on Tuesdays down the old road that passed the pasture, and come home with fresh bread wrapped in brown paper, sometimes with jam, sometimes with a sprig of rosemary stuck in her pocket. He didn't miss those days. He didn't long for them. He simply let them return, like a familiar breeze that finds its way through the window without knocking. He stood by the fence for a while longer, then walked back toward the house. The bike stayed where it was. He didn't move it, didn't ask whose it was. He figured Owen had left it there. Perhaps a game had called him away. Perhaps he'd forgotten it for now. Or perhaps it had been left there on purpose. A quiet offering, a child's way of saying, I was here. Back on the porch, Eli picked up his tea again. It had cooled past drinkable, but he held it anyway, feeling the comfort of the cup in his hands. The clouds shifted slowly overhead, casting long patches of shadow across the field. The willow down by the river swayed only slightly, as if nodding to something he couldn't yet hear. He thought of how many things come back, not through words or footsteps, but through objects, through a bowl, a scarf, a bicycle leaning against a fence, and how each of those things carried within them the soft breath of memory, not to be opened wide, but to be held lightly. Toward evening, he walked back to the bike, picked it up gently, wheeled it under the eaves of the shed, not to take it, not to hide it, just to keep it from the damp. He leaned it carefully against the wall and placed a smooth stone on the seat, the kind of stone a child might recognize as theirs. Then he stood there a moment longer, watching the sky grow dim behind the trees, listening to the world settle. That night he left the porch light on, not for the bike, not for Owen, not for anything in particular, just because the light had always made the house feel like someone was still waiting. He turned off the lamps inside, left the fire to its fading glow, and paused once more at the window. Out there in the near dark, the bike rested, the stone still on its seat, the fence standing behind it like an old companion. Eli whispered something under his breath, not a prayer, not a wish, just a thank you to the day, to the object, to the memory that arrived without asking. And then he went to bed, the cat already curled beside the pillow, the night stretching out quiet and soft, like a road that turns but doesn't end. Some mornings arrive with the scent of wet earth in the air, not from rain, but from the quiet lifting of dew, from grass still bowed, from soil beginning to warm beneath the soft weight of sunlight. It was such a morning when Eli found himself standing in the mudroom, the small narrow space between the back door and the kitchen where boots gathered and coats waited their turn. He hadn't planned to be there. He had only meant to fetch something from the shelf. A spool of twine, perhaps, or a jar of sandpaper tucked behind the matches. But his eyes drifted downward, and there, half hidden beneath a folded tarp, rested a pair of old shoes, not work boots, not the rubber ones for garden chores, but the other kind, leather, soft from years, creased across the top where his foot had bent again and again. He crouched slowly, picked one up by its heel, turned it in his hand. The laces were stiff, the tongue curled back just slightly. The sole, though worn, still held its shape. A walking shoe, not built for speed, not for distance, but for the steady pace of a man who knows the names of his fields, who stops to listen to the sound bark makes when the wind leans in. He carried them into the kitchen, set them gently near the door, and put the kettle on the stove. While it warmed, he found the old brush, short-handled, bristles faded and soft, and a small cloth, once white, now the color of the dust it had spent years wiping away. He poured a bowl of warm water, not hot, just enough to coax the memory from leather. Then he sat near the light on the bench beside the door and placed one shoe in his lap. He began with the brush, long, slow strokes across the side, lifting the thin veil of dust that had settled over time. The bristles moved in rhythm, not hurried, not idle, like sweeping a porch, like raking leaves, like remembering something that never fully left. He didn't think of any one day in particular, but images came anyway. Not loud, but steady. A trail through the woods behind the old schoolhouse, the crunch of twigs, the hush of pine needles underfoot. Her laugh once when he tripped on a root and said the forest was conspiring. A picnic on the far side of the ridge, where the moss grew thick and the air smelled of cedar and rain. The way she had tied her scarf to a branch so they could find their way back, though they never strayed far enough to need it. He moved to the second shoe, his fingers working the cloth gently around the toe, into the curve of the heel, along the stitching he once re-sewed by hand when the store in town no longer carried their size. The leather drank in the water slowly, darkening just a little, then settling into itself again. He sat back, looked at them both side by side on the floor, as if they might ask to be worn again. But he didn't reach for socks, didn't bend down to lace them up. He just let them sit there, let them breathe, let them remember their shape. The cat rubbed against his ankle, then jumped up to the windowsill, its tail flicking once. Outside, a breeze had picked up, light but certain. It carried the smell of wet wood, of grass, of something beginning. Eli poured his tea, sat at the table, and looked toward the door. The shoes hadn't moved. Of course not. But something in the room had shifted, not changed, just realigned. As if by touching them, he had touched something in himself. Not nostalgia, not longing, just a quiet thread that still held. He thought briefly about giving them away. Someone else might use them, might walk the same trails, might leave new prints. But he knew he wouldn't, not because he needed to keep them, but because some things belong to the shape of our lives, even when they're no longer worn. They remind us not of where we've been, but of how we move through it, one step at a time, one field, one bend in the river, one shared silence beneath a tree. That afternoon, he placed the shoes back where he'd found them, not hidden, but not in the way. He set them upright, smoothed the laces just a little, let them rest, clean and dry. He left the cloth nearby, damp from use, warm from memory, and as he closed the door behind him, he felt something settle inside, like the weight of soil in a seedling pot, like the sound of gravel under a slow boot, like the pause before the next breath. It was the kind of morning that didn't call attention to itself. The sky was soft, not blue, not gray, just a quiet color, like linen faded from years in sunlight. The ground was dry underfoot, though dew had visited early, and the air smelled faintly of hay and coffee, though neither had been touched yet. Eli had risen slow the way he often did, feet to floor, one deep breath, then the careful making of tea. The cat remained in its usual place, curled in the corner of the couch, content with silence. The house held its shape, held its quiet, until the knock, just once, soft, like someone unsure if they should. When Eli opened the door, there was no one there, only the morning and a small parcel resting on the step, wrapped in brown paper, string tied clean, a return address written in a hand he didn't recognize right away. He picked it up, not hurried, not cautious, just curious in the way one is when the world offers something unexpected on an ordinary day. Back inside, he placed it on the table, set his tea beside it, and sat. He let the parcel sit there for a moment, as if it needed time to get used to the room. Then he untied the string, unfolded the paper. Inside was a smaller envelope. No note, no explanation, only a name written on the front. His. The handwriting, now that he looked again, felt familiar. Slanted slightly, letters a little tall for the line. He slid his thumb under the flap and pulled out a photograph, black and white, worn at the corners, softened by time. And there they were, he and her, sitting beneath the willow tree, long before the garden had fences, long before the porch light had a reason to stay on. They looked younger, of course, but not different. She wore a dress he vaguely remembered, small flowers near the collar, a loose braid over one shoulder. He sat beside her, one hand resting on a book, the other mid-motion, as if he'd just said something and hadn't yet finished the thought. They weren't smiling, but they weren't solemn either, just there, present in the way people are when they haven't yet realized that time moves. Eli held the photo for a long while. He didn't study it, didn't search the background for clues. He just looked, and let the looking be enough. He didn't remember the photo being taken. He didn't remember who held the camera, but he remembered the moment, or at least the feel of it, the way the grass tickled the back of his neck, the way her voice sounded in open air, the way the light moved through willow leaves like water. Eventually, he set the photo down, facing upward on the table. He stood, refilled his tea, and returned to sit beside it. Not opposite it, but beside it, like company. He didn't feel nostalgic, didn't ache. He simply felt surrounded, as though something long folded away had unfolded itself again. Not loudly, not to demand anything, just to say, I'm still part of this. The cat, stirred, jumped softly to the floor and patted over. It looked once at the photograph, then curled beside Eli's foot and slept. The room held its stillness, held the photo, held the memory without weight, and Eli, with both hands around the mug, leaned back into the chair and whispered, I remember now. Not a detail, not a date, just the being there, the fact of it, the truth that it had once happened and was now still happening in a way words couldn't shape. That afternoon, he placed the photograph in a small wooden frame. Nothing fancy, just something to keep it from bending. He set it on the corner of the desk where the afternoon sun reached for an hour or two each day. Then he left the room, made bread dough, folded towels, checked the garden for signs of rabbits. He didn't return to the photo that day. He didn't need to. It was there now, part of the house again, part of the silence, part of the warmth that moved between shadow and wall. And that night, as he sat on the porch with the blanket over his knees and the last light fading behind the ridge, he thought of how things return, not to take us back, but to walk with us forward, quietly, faithfully, like a letter that waited years to be opened, like a photograph that remembered for you. like the sound of her voice not in your ear, but in the way you pause before saying anything at all. There are some mornings when the house feels quieter than usual, not because anything is missing, but because everything seems to be listening. The walls, the floor, the kettle warming on the stove, they all seem to carry breath, but hold it just a little longer as if not to disturb the light falling in at an angle through the window. It was one of those mornings. Eli had woken with the taste of words in his mouth, not his own, but ones once spoken across the table, over tea, beneath lamplight, words that belonged to stories, to pages once read aloud, then paused with a gentle hand. He didn't know what stirred the memory. Maybe the coolness of the floorboards, maybe the soft creak of the chair near the fireplace, but he found himself walking slowly toward the tall bookshelf in the narrow room off the kitchen. The shelf held many things, not just books, but also time, pressed flowers between pages, receipts tucked as bookmarks, little notes scribbled in margins with the pencil she kept clipped to the hem of her apron. He scanned the rows without reading titles, trusting his hands to find what his eyes hadn't yet remembered. And there it was, a green spine, worn corners. The cover faded along one edge where the sun had leaned on it for what must have been 1,000 mornings. He pulled it out slowly, held it flat in both hands. The binding gave a gentle sigh, and the scent of aged paper rose like a whisper. He didn't open it yet. He carried it to the kitchen table, poured himself a cup of tea, and sat. Only then did he let the pages fall open. Near the middle, a single page had been folded. Not sharply, just enough to mark a moment. There was no bookmark, no note, no explanation. But Eli knew this was where she had stopped. Perhaps it had been a Tuesday. Perhaps the bread had needed checking. Perhaps she had paused because the light outside had changed in a way that asked for looking. He touched the folded corner gently, then smoothed it open, not to undo it, but to share in the pause. He read the paragraph she had last finished. It was about a woman walking a dirt path toward a field of wild rye, the wind rising through the stalks, the horizon wide in gold, nothing dramatic, nothing urgent, but it was written the way she loved, slow, careful, like each word had waited its turn. He smiled. He could almost hear her voice reading the sentences out loud, pausing just before the word horizon, as if tasting it. He didn't read on. He didn't need to know how the story ended. Some books weren't about ending. Some pages lived best when they stayed open, when the space between paragraphs became a place to rest. He closed the book softly, leaving it open only just enough that the page stayed remembered. Then he set it on the table beside his tea. The cat wandered in, gave the book a cursory glance, then leapt onto the bench, curling into a warm comma of fur. Eli took another sip from the mug, then traced the edge of the book's cover with one finger. He didn't plan to put it back on the shelf. Not today, not for a while. He liked the way it looked beside the window, like it had always belonged to the morning light. Later that day, he carried the book to the porch, set it beside the rocking chair, let the breeze flutter a few of the pages open again, not the marked one, but nearby, as if the wind too had its favorite parts. And he sat, watching the light settle across the field, watching the willows shift with the wind's slow questions. The book stayed open, not being read, just being. That evening, as dusk arrived quietly and the first star appeared above the ridge, he brought the book back inside. He placed it not on the shelf, but on the small table beside the bed, where once she had set her glasses down. and a mug of mint tea, and sometimes a small stone from the path outside. He let it stay there, unclosed, and as the house darkened gently around him, he whispered into the stillness, "We'll finish it another day." Not as a promise, not as a plan, just as a way of saying, "I'm still here, and so are you." There is a certain kind of quiet that settles in the house after noon. It is not the hush of nightfall, nor the stillness of early morning. It's a softer quiet, the kind that arrives when the world outside is caught between tasks and the sun pauses midway across the kitchen floor. It was during this kind of hour that Eli found himself standing in the hallway, his hand resting on the worn edge of the old oak cabinet. He hadn't meant to stop there. He was only passing through, a cup in hand, the kettle still warm, the cat already dozing on the windowsill, but something in the air, a flicker of dust in the light, a shift in shadow, brought his gaze to the second drawer from the bottom. That drawer, the one no one ever used anymore, the one she used to open with a little tug and a sigh. It creaked when it moved, it always had, a soft wooden sigh as though the drawer itself needed time to remember how to open. He set the cup down carefully on the hallway table and crouched beside the cabinet. His knees didn't move as easily as they once had, but he welcomed the weight of it. The grounding. He wrapped his hand around the small brass pull and eased the drawer open. It stuck as expected, then gave way. The scent that rose was not unpleasant. Dust, wood, a faint trace of lavender or linen starch. Hard to say. Inside were things neither important nor meaningless. A folded bit of cloth, blue and soft, frayed at the edge. A button, ivory with 4 holes still tied with red thread, a coil of rickrack ribbon, the color of faded marigold, a matchbox holding 2 acorns, one cracked, one whole, a postcard with a corner torn off, bearing the picture of a lighthouse no one in the family had ever seen, and beneath it all, a little stack of paper scraps, torn from different notebooks, each with a line or 2 written in her hand. He picked them up slowly, one at a time. They weren't journal entries, they weren't letters, just small notes. Half-thoughts, phrases, reminders. Buy apples from the stall with the striped awning. Ask Eli about the name of the bird with the red belly. Don't forget, Wednesday is bread day. He smiled. Not because any of it was remarkable, but because it wasn't. It was exactly the kind of life they had built, quiet, steady, marked by small observations and careful tending. He read one note twice. The green bowl is best for late plums. That was all. No signature, no date, but he could see the bowl in his mind. He still used it, often without thinking, and now, because of these words, he would never use it again without also remembering the feel of her hands rinsing the fruit in the sink, holding them up to the light to see which ones had bruised. He placed the notes back gently, stacked them as they were, not in order. There was none to begin with, just presence. He tucked the button beside them, looped the ribbon once more, and closed the matchbox over. The acorns. None of it belonged in a museum. None of it needed to be kept. But it would be, because sometimes it isn't the thing itself that matters, but the hands that once chose to keep it. He sat back on the floor for a while longer, knees drawn, hands resting on his thighs. The hallway was quiet, the way it always was in the middle of the day. Outside, the wind made no effort. The trees stood still. Even the birds seemed to be somewhere else. But in that drawer, in that collection of quiet nothings, Eli had found something full, something warm, not a revelation, not a lesson, just a feeling. that love, when lived fully, leaves a trail of softness behind. Later, he would share none of this with anyone. He wouldn't mention the drawer, wouldn't quote the notes, wouldn't take a picture of the matchbox, but he would tie the ribbon around a bundle of mint from the garden, and he would set the green bowl on the table, half filled with plums from the market, some sweet, some still tart. And when Owen came by that week, mud on his knees and questions about bees, Eli would hand him one of the plums without explanation, because some things, the best things, are meant to be passed on, not in words, but in the way we live. The afternoon carried wind, not the kind that chased leaves down the road or rattled windows, but the kind that slipped through cracked panes, lifted the lace curtain just so, and reminded Eli that the house breathed too. He stood for a moment at the kitchen sink, watching the movement of shadow on the wall. Then, without any real decision, he dried his hands, pushed open the door to the back room, and walked toward the desk. The chair gave its familiar creak. The paper still sat in its usual drawer, neatly stacked, edges square. He took one sheet, not because he had something to say, not yet, but because the paper looked like it might be ready to listen. He sat quietly for a time, watching the wind move across the fields beyond the window. Then he picked up the pen. It didn't take long for the words to come, not words he had planned, not the ones he'd once rehearsed in silence, just the ones that rose up now, unasked, unhurried. The days have been gentle lately, not always easy, just gentle. I suppose that's all one can really ask for. There's a green bowl on the table now, with plums in it. You'd like the color of them this week, deep and dusky, like evening just before the stars show. The cat still doesn't care for company, but he's grown used to me talking to him like I'd talk to you. He blinks back like he understands most of it. He paused, let the pen hover, then continued. I cleaned your teapot last week, not because it needed it, just because I missed the feel of it in my hands. I've started reading the book you left open, only a page or two. It felt less like picking up a story, and more like sitting beside someone who had paused mid-sentence and didn't mind waiting. There are still things I wish I'd said, not big things, just the small ones, like how you always tapped the jar before you opened it, or how your handwriting made lists look like poems. The wind pressed a little firmer against the window now. Eli looked up, watched the branches of the willow sway, not in sorrow, but in rhythm. He placed the pen down for a moment, rested his hand on the paper, then he wrote again. There's a drawer in the hall I finally opened. I found a ribbon, a button, some of your notes. You probably don't remember writing them, but they were yours all the same, and they mattered, they still do. Everything smaller you touched has stayed soft, somehow. He didn't write a closing, didn't sign his name. The letter had no addressee, no date, only the weight of being written. He folded it once, then again, placed it in an envelope, left it unsealed, and slipped it into the old tin box where he kept string, spare keys, and the small photograph that had arrived weeks earlier. Then he closed the lid, not as an end, just as a gesture, a quiet placing of something into the keeping of time. That evening he lit the lamp early. The wind had brought a chill, and the light helped the room hold its warmth. He sat in the rocker, blanket across his lap, book unopened on the armrest. Outside, the sky turned slowly from pearl to slate, and the first stars began to blink. He didn't think about the letter, didn't wonder what it meant, didn't worry about remembering what it said. It had done its part. The act of writing had let something go, or maybe it let something in. He wasn't sure which, maybe both. And when the fire had gone low and the night had come quiet, Eli stood. He walked slowly through the house, turned out the lamps one by one, and left the porch light on. Not for anyone in particular, but just to let the dark know that someone within was resting. Then he lay down, not to forget, not to dream, just to be still in a house that no longer felt quiet in the same way, but fuller, softer, as if it too had heard the words and now held them gently in its walls. The rain arrived quietly. It didn't sweep in from the hills, didn't beat against the windows. It simply began, the way a breath deepens or a memory returns. Eli had noticed the air change first. The wind shifted, turned cool near the collar, and the sky took on that gentle silver that comes just before the drops begin to fall. By the time he stepped onto the porch, a soft pattering had begun, like fingertips drumming on old wood, steady but unhurried. He sat in the rocker, wrapped a blanket around his knees, and let the moment open around him. The roof above the porch was thin in places, patched once or twice with flattened cans and stubborn nails. It sang in the rain, not loud, but steady, a rhythm older than clocks, more honest too. It didn't mark time, it marked presence. Each drop a small reminder, here and here and here again. He didn't bring a book, didn't need tea, didn't call the cat. He simply rocked and listened. The land beyond the house grew softer. The lines blurred. The garden sank into a darker green, and the path to the willow became a ribbon of wet earth. Everything hushed. Even the birds tucked themselves into branches and let the sky do the talking. The porch boards were cool beneath his feet, bare and slightly damp where the mist had drifted in. He traced a knot in the wood with one toe, a familiar groove worn smooth by years of pacing, of pausing, of standing with hands in pockets just to breathe in the evening air. He looked out toward the fence line, where the bicycle still leaned, now beaded with rain, each droplet catching what little light remained. It hadn't moved, neither had he. But the world kept changing, minute by minute, and somehow he felt part of it again, not apart, but within. A frog called out once, low and hopeful, somewhere near the creek, just past the willow. Eli smiled, though he didn't know why. The sound reminded him of evenings long ago when she would hum while stirring soup, and the windows would fog at the corners, and they'd sit together in that same quiet, not speaking, not needing to. Back then, the rain had seemed more frequent, or maybe it just stayed longer, or maybe they had listened longer. The light shifted slightly, the clouds thinned, not enough for sun, but enough for silver to break through. The world glowed, not brightly, but like embers, held deep within things. The porch, the trees, the folds of his blanket, everything seemed to exhale, and so did he. He closed his eyes, not to sleep, just to rest deeper into the sound. The drops above him fell in gentle rhythm, each one its own note in a lullaby written without paper. The roof sang, the wood creaked, the wind moved like an old friend smoothing a hand across his shoulders, and Eli, with no need to speak, no need to stir, let himself be still. Let the rain do what it did best, hold the world softly. When he opened his eyes again, the shadows had shifted. The rain had not stopped, but it had quieted further. A whisper now, more suggestion than sound. The cat had joined him, curled at his feet, content with the company in the hush. He reached down, stroked the fur behind its ear, and thought, not of anything new, but of everything known. The smell of wood smoke, the feel of wet socks drying by the stove, the way a letter folds in half, the sound of her breath just before sleep. He stayed on the porch until the lamps inside called softly, until the last light faded from the far ridge, until the sky turned the color of river stone, and when he stood, the blanket fell from his lap like leaves in autumn. Quietly, without rush, he picked it up, draped it over the arm of the chair, and paused once more to listen to the rain finish its thought. Then he stepped inside, the door clicking shut behind him, and the house embraced him gently, as it always had, as it always would. The rain had faded to mist, and the wind had gone elsewhere. The porch, once filled with the music of falling water, now sat quiet, its boards drying under the softness of night, its rocker still warm with the memory of where Eli had been. Inside, the lamps were low. The air held the smell of the river and wood, and something faintly sweet. Perhaps the plum bowl in the kitchen, or perhaps nothing at all. Sometimes a room just remembers sweetness. Eli stood in the hallway, his hand resting gently on the edge of the door frame, as though deciding whether to turn back or to keep moving forward into sleep. He wasn't tired, not in the usual sense. There was no heaviness in his limbs, no ache in his eyes, but there was a quiet inside him that asked for stillness, a quiet that wasn't asking to be filled, only held. The bedroom was already dim. The moon hung low outside the window, casting its pale light in a thin ribbon across the floorboards, touching the corner of the rug and the edge of the quilt at the foot of the bed. The bed had been made that morning, not with tight corners or crisp folds, but with care. He had fluffed the pillows, tucked the blanket just enough, and left the window open an inch, the way she used to like. The breeze had changed since then, cooler now, carrying the hush of evening fields and the quiet of trees after rain. He sat on the edge of the bed, slipped off his shoes slowly, the way one unpacks memories at the end of a long and full day. His socks followed, folded neatly, set aside. He turned off the lamp, leaving only the moonlight, and lay down without a sound. The mattress knew him, met his shape like a familiar hand, and the pillow cradled his head with the softness earned over years. He listened to the night, to the tick of the old clock in the other room, to the way the wind stirred the willow just barely, to the house settling into its rest, wood shifting, walls breathing, and to his own breath, steady and slow, in, outside, in again. The cat padded in, a shadow with paws. It leapt soundlessly onto the foot of the bed, circled once, and settled. Eli didn't open his eyes. He didn't need to. He could feel the weight of the world curling beside him, not as burden, but as company, as presence, as peace. His hand reached for the corner of the quilt, pulled it up just past his chest. The fabric smelled faintly of rosemary and sun. He let his fingers rest there, on the rise and fall of his breath, and in that quiet, he thought of nothing, not because he forced it, but because the day had spoken all that it needed to say. The willow would be there tomorrow, the plums would ripen or not. The drawer in the hallway would remain closed until it wasn't. The house would go on holding its soft treasures, and Eli would sleep, not from exhaustion, not from escape, but from fullness. And if a dream came, it would come like the rain, gentle and steady, carrying him not away from the life he had known, but deeper into it. where every step through the garden, every touch of her hand on the teapot, every letter left unsent, was still there, waiting, not to be finished, only to be remembered, and then let go, like breath, like sleep. And so the house grows still. The light behind the hills has faded and the day quietly lays itself to rest. If you've made it here, I hope your heart feels just a little softer, your breath a little slower, as the hush of this evening wraps gently around you. May you sleep deeply tonight, without the weight of worry, held only by peace and the memory of quiet things that asked for nothing but stayed anyway. If this story brought you comfort, you're always welcome to let me know. Sometimes a few simple words shared beneath the stars are all we need. And if you'd like, you can whisper back a thought. What kind of story would you like me to tell next? Sweet dreams, dear one. You're safe here, always.